stranded on a death world, the only survivors of the crash. The cargo hold smelled like recycled air and failure. Dalton Reed sat on a storage crate with his datapad balanced on one knee, scrolling through the third rejection message in as many hours. The words blurred together: insufficient experience, position filled, we wish you well in your future endeavors, and he was about to close the screen when the ship's alarm system shrieked to life. The sound cut through his skull like a blade. Red emergency lighting flooded the hold as the deck lurched sideways, sending him sprawling against the bulkhead. His datapad skittered across the floor and disappeared under a cargo net. The alarm kept screaming, joined now by the deep, metallic groan of a ship's superstructure being asked to do something it was never designed for. Dalton grabbed a support strut and hauled himself upright. The deck was tilting. That wasn't turbulence. That was gravity, winning an argument with failing engines. He ran. The corridor outside the cargo hold was a nightmare of flashing lights and howling klaxons. Other passengers stumbled past him, some crying, most silent with shock. The ship bucked again and Dalton slammed shoulder first into the wall, felt something in his collarbone crunch, kept moving. Pain could wait. Pain was a luxury for people who survived the next 5 minutes. The escape pod bay was forward, past the passenger cabins. Dalton pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shouts and grabbing hands. The artificial gravity cut out without warning, and suddenly he was floating, tumbling, clawing at handholds, while bodies and luggage spun around him in the strobing red light. He reached the pod bay. The hatch was open. Every pod cradle was empty. The deck slammed back into existence beneath his feet as gravity returned in a sickening lurch. Dalton hit the floor hard enough to feel his teeth crack together. Around him, people were screaming, but the sound seemed far away, muffled by the roar of atmosphere tearing at the hull. They were going down. He staggered back into the corridor and forced his brain to work through the adrenaline. No pods, no time to reach the bridge. His eyes landed on a maintenance access panel. The emergency shelters, the reinforced sections designed to survive hull breaches, were scattered throughout the ship. If he could reach one, seal it before impact. The ship screamed. Metal shrieked as the hull began to peel away. Dalton felt the air pressure drop, felt his ears pop, tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. He grabbed the access panel and wrenched it open, threw himself into the maintenance tunnel beyond. The tunnel was barely wide enough for his shoulders. He crawled forward on his elbows, following the emergency lighting strips that marked the path to the nearest shelter. The impact when it came was surprisingly gentle. The world simply stopped making sense. Up became sideways, became down. Dalton felt his body slam against every surface of the tunnel in rapid succession, felt ribs crack and skin tear, and then there was darkness and silence and the smell of burning plastic. He woke to pain. Everything hurt. His left arm was trapped under debris, his right hand was bleeding through his glove, and something sharp was digging into his lower back. Dalton tested his limbs one at a time. Fingers, toes, ankles, knees, everything moved. Everything screamed at him for moving it. He was alive. The maintenance tunnel had collapsed around him, but the emergency shelter hatch was visible 3 meters ahead, partially blocked by a twisted beam. Dalton began to dig himself out. It took an hour. Maybe 2. Time felt slippery. He freed his arm, cleared the debris from his legs, crawled forward until he could reach the shelter hatch. It opened with a pneumatic hiss that sounded impossibly loud in the settling wreckage. Inside, the shelter was intact. Emergency supplies lined the walls: water, medical kits, thermal blankets. Dalton allowed himself 30 seconds to sit and breathe before forcing himself back to his feet. He needed to find other survivors. He needed to assess the damage. He needed to figure out where the hell they'd crashed and whether the air outside would kill him if he tried to breathe it. He pulled a respirator from the supply locker and checked its charge, 12 hours. That would have to do. The wreckage was worse than he'd imagined. The ship had broken into at least 3 major sections, scattered across a landscape of rust-colored rock and sparse, twisted vegetation. The passenger section was 50 meters away, its hull cracked open like an egg. Dalton made his way across the debris field, calling out, listening for responses that didn't come. The bodies he found were already cold. He moved through the wreckage methodically, checking every space large enough to hold a person, cataloging supplies as he went, a cargo pod with emergency rations, a medical station with its cabinet intact, a storage locker full of thermal suits. He was beginning to think he was truly alone when he heard it. A faint sound, metal shifting against metal, rhythmic and deliberate. Dalton followed the sound to what had been the passenger cabin's forward section. The bulkhead had collapsed inward, creating a maze of twisted metal and shattered composite panels. He squeezed through a gap and found her. She was blue. That was his first thought, nonsensical and unhelpful. Blue skin, luminous in the dim emergency lighting that still flickered in the wreckage. White markings across her face, geometric and deliberate. Long hair the color of sunset caught under the beam that pinned her leg to the deck. She was alive. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and her eyes, pale, almost colorless, tracked to his face as he approached. "Don't," she said. Her voice was hoarse but controlled. "Don't come closer." Dalton ignored her and knelt beside the beam. It was part of the structural support, thick composite material designed to hold a ship together. It had done its job. Now it was crushing her leg just above the knee. "I'm getting you out," he said. "You cannot." She spoke precisely, each word carefully shaped. "The weight distribution is unstable. Any attempt to move the beam will cause further collapse. Then I'll cut through it. The risk is acceptable." Dalton was already pulling the plasma torch from his tool belt. The small cutting torch was designed for maintenance work, not rescue operations, but it would have to do. "Tell me if you feel the pressure change." She stared at him, those pale eyes wide and unblinking. Something in her face shifted. The white markings on her skin seemed to pulse with faint bioluminescence. Then she gave a single, sharp nod. The cut took 15 minutes. Dalton worked in short bursts, letting the torch cool between cuts, acutely aware of every groan and shift in the wreckage around them. The blue woman, Valorian, he realized, recognizing her species from news footage he'd barely paid attention to, remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled, and even despite what must have been excruciating pain. When the beam finally separated, Dalton dropped the torch and grabbed the severed section with both hands. He lifted, muscles screaming, and the woman pulled her leg free in one smooth motion. She didn't cry out, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, and said, "You came back." "No one else did," Dalton said. He held out his hand. "Can you walk?" She took his hand, her palm was hot against his, her fingers longer than human proportions. "I will try." They emerged from the wreckage together into the fading light of an alien sunset. The sky was the color of old bruises, purple and yellow and sick green. The air tasted sweet even through Dalton's respirator, a wrongness that made his thoughts feel sluggish and thick. The Valorian woman, he didn't know her name yet, stood beside him and surveyed the landscape with a stillness that might have been shock or might have been something else entirely. Her facial markings flickered weakly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight he was only beginning to understand. "We are on Cathara 7, she said. "We should be dead." "Yeah," Dalton agreed. He was still holding her hand. He wasn't sure when that had happened. "We'll work on that." Night was falling fast, and with it came cold that cut through his torn flight suit like glass. They needed shelter. They needed water. They needed to find out if anything in this wreckage could send a distress signal to a universe that probably already thought they were dead. But first, they needed to survive until morning. Dalton led the way back to the emergency shelter, the Valorian woman limping beside him, and neither of them spoke about the sweetness in the air or the way the darkness seemed to move at the edges of their vision. They had 12 hours of respirator charge, 2 weeks of food if they were careful, and no way to call for help. They had each other, whether either of them wanted that or not. The shelter door sealed behind them with a hiss that sounded too much like a tomb closing. Dalton activated the heating unit and rationed out emergency water while the Valorian woman sat against the far wall, her pale eyes never leaving his face. Outside, something howled in the distance, a sound that belonged to nightmares, rising and falling like tortured metal. "My name is Esilt," she said finally. Dalton, he passed her a water pouch. You know anything about xenobiology? Why? Because whatever's in the air out there is making me see things that aren't there. He met her eyes and saw his own fear reflected back at him, controlled but undeniable. And I need to know if it's going to kill us before something else does. Esselt's markings pulsed once, bright and sharp. Then we should begin. They fell into rhythm by the third day. Dalton scavenged wreckage for supplies while Esselt analyzed the ship's damaged data core, her long fingers working through corrupted files with methodical patience. He taught her to gut the small creatures he trapped. She identified the spores contaminating the atmosphere as fungal reproductive structures that would cause respiratory failure within 2 weeks once their respirator filters degraded. We need to repair the distress beacon, Esselt said, surrounded by salvaged circuit boards. The coordinates are recoverable if we can transmit. Big if. Dalton was coaxing a power cell back to life. The transmitter's fused. Need components I don't have. But you will try. It wasn't a question. He looked up and found her watching him with that unnerving Valorian stillness, pale eyes reflecting emergency lighting. Her hair was braided back, making the magenta and pink seem deliberate rather than alien. Beautiful, though he tried not to think about that. Yeah, he said, I'll try. What surprised him was wanting to succeed not just for survival, but because Esselt looked at broken things like puzzles with solutions waiting. She studied him sometimes when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Her markings pulsing in rhythms he was learning meant curiosity rather than fear. You talk to machines, she observed one afternoon. They like encouragement. The power regulator sparked, and he swore, shaking burned fingers. Sometimes things just need to know someone gives a damn. Is that why you came back for me? Dalton set down his tools. I came back because leaving you would have made me someone I don't want to be. Her markings flared bright enough to cast shadows. She turned back to her work without responding, but later when they rationed the evening meal, she sat closer than necessary. When their shoulders touched, neither moved away. The apex stalker came on the 7th day. Dalton was 200 meters out, scavenging cargo wreckage, when the small creatures went silent. He'd learned those silences meant predator. He turned slowly, scanning rust-colored rocks and skeletal vegetation. The creature was massive and low to the ground, covered in overlapping plates that shimmered with heat distortion. No visible eyes, but its head tracked him with perfect precision. When it opened its mouth, Dalton saw crystalline teeth like blades. The creature followed with terrifying speed, clawed feet finding purchase on rocks he had to scramble over. The shelter was too far. Dalton grabbed twisted hull plating and swung it like a club. The creature dodged and came from the side, jaws snapping centimeters from his leg. Esselt ran toward them with the plasma torch, its cutting flame bright against the hazy afternoon. She thrust it at the creature's face. It recoiled, eyeless head swiveling between them. Dalton fired the salvaged flare gun. The projectile exploded against rock, filling air with magnesium light and chemical smoke. The apex stalker retreated, thermal sensors overwhelmed, but its claws found Dalton's ribs first. Impact drove air from his lungs, then came fire spreading across his left side in waves that turned vision white. He was on the ground. Esselt's hands were on his shoulders, her voice tight with something that might have been fear. Don't move, Dalton, look at me. Her face filled his vision, white markings blazing like stars, blood spread across his shirt, hot and wet. The shelter, he managed. She hooked arms under his and lifted him easily, Valorian strength making the act look effortless. Stay conscious. Talk to me. About what? Why you talk to machines. They're honest, his words slurred. They break, you fix them, no hidden agendas. That is lonely. Haven't had much reason to trust people. She laid him on thermal blankets in the shelter, hands shaking as she opened the medical kit. The wounds were deep, 3 parallel lacerations where claws had found flesh. I do not know human physiology well enough, Esselt said. Control cracking. I could make this worse. Can't get much worse. Dalton caught her wrist, felt her racing pulse. I trust you. Her markings went supernova bright. Something in her expression opened, vulnerable in ways he suspected Valorians were trained never to be. "Then I will not fail you," she said quietly. The next 2 days passed in fragments, fever dreams where shelter walls breathed, moments of clarity finding her beside him, exhaustion carved into her features, hand resting near his like an anchor. Once he woke to her tracing scars on his knuckles with careful curiosity. When she realized he was watching, she didn't pull away. "You have been injured many times." "Occupational hazard." His voice was rough. "Salvage work's not safe. Yet you chose it." Chose is a strong word. Pain was manageable now, dulled by medications she'd synthesized. Mostly took whatever work kept me moving. Staying in one place felt like drowning. "I understand." Her fingers stilled on his hand. "I chose diplomatic service for similar reasons. Constant travel, formal protocols, no expectation of personal connection. It seemed preferable to admitting I was lonely." Her markings pulsed in slow, melancholy patterns. "My people value collective harmony, but I never understood how to be part of it. I was always observing, analyzing, separate. Diplomatic work made that separation official." Dalton turned his hand palm up, offering. Esselt stared, then laced her fingers through his. Her skin was warm, grip strong and certain. "I'm glad you were on that ship," he said. "That is statistically improbable reasoning." "Maybe, but I'm still glad." They sat while the heating unit hummed and something howled outside, and the world tried its best to kill them. Esselt's markings settled into soft, steady glow. Her thumb traced small circles on his palm, unconscious and rhythmic. When Dalton was strong enough to walk, he returned to beacon repair with renewed focus. Survival had weight now, substance beyond simple stubbornness. He was rewiring the transmitter housing when he found it. The data chip was wedged into the beacon's primary relay, physically blocking circuit connections. Deliberate sabotage. Dalton pulled it free and brought it to Esselt, gut churning with sick certainty. "Evidence," he said. "Someone wanted that beacon dead before we left orbit." Esselt's face went carefully blank as she loaded the chip into the data core. A navigation log appeared, time-stamped 3 hours before the crash. Cathara 7's coordinates transmitted to an encrypted receiver. Underneath, authentication codes from the ship's bridge. Captain Ven's codes. "The crash was not an accident," Esselt said, voice deadly calm. "Someone brought us here deliberately. Question is, who survived to see it through?" She looked at him. Her markings had gone dark, defensive. "That is a dangerous question." "You think I did this?" The words came out harder than intended. "Sabotaged the ship, killed everyone, then stuck around to dig you out?" "Logic demands I consider all possibilities." Her eyes were ice-pale and unreadable. "You are a salvage engineer. You have technical knowledge, and you were in the cargo hold when failure began. Convenient positioning for someone who knew what was coming." "Convenient." Dalton stood, ignoring the pull of barely healed wounds. "Right, because I definitely plan to crash land on a death world." "Prove otherwise." "How?" "By dying for you again?" He grabbed his tool belt, jaw tight with fury and something that hurt worse. "Believe what you want, Esselt. I'm done trying to convince people I'm worth trusting." He left before she could respond, stepped into toxic air without checking his respirator charge, didn't look back when he heard her call his name. The wreckage stretched before him, twisted metal and broken promises. Dalton walked into it alone, like he'd walked into everything else in his life, and tried not to think about how Esselt's hand had felt in his, or that trust, once offered, could be revoked just as easily. Behind him, the shelter door sealed shut, and the silence that followed felt like the end of something he'd barely begun to understand. Dalton spent 2 days alone in the wreckage, sleeping in a cargo pod with a malfunctioning door seal and working on the beacon until his hands bled. He told himself it was focus, dedication to survival. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. He couldn't face going back to the shelter and seeing Esselt look at him with those ice-pale eyes full of suspicion. The beacon mocked him. Every circuit he repaired revealed 3 more that were damaged beyond salvage. He needed components that didn't exist in the wreckage, materials that required manufacturing equipment he'd never see again. But he kept working because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the way her fingers had felt laced through his. On the third morning, the electrical storm rolled in. The sky turned the color of infected wounds, green and yellow and black. Lightning arced between clouds in patterns that looked almost deliberate, and the air pressure dropped so fast Dalton's ears popped. He was 100 meters from the shelter, exposed on open ground, when the first drops hit. The rain burned. Not metaphorically. The water carried enough dissolved minerals and spore toxins to sting exposed skin on contact. Dalton ran for the nearest cover, a twisted section of hull that formed a crude overhang. Thunder cracked close enough to feel in his chest, and through the downpour he saw movement near the shelter. Esselt was outside, struggling with the water collection system they'd rigged to catch rainfall. The storm was tearing it apart, and she was trying to secure the containers before they were lost, alone, unprotected. Dalton was moving before he consciously decided to move. The apex stalker came out of the rain like a nightmare made solid. Bigger than the first one, or maybe it was the same creature returned with learned behavior and patient hunger. It moved between Esselt and the shelter with predatory intelligence, cutting off her escape. Dalton shouted her name. The sound was swallowed by thunder, but she turned and saw him. Saw the creature. Her markings flared bright enough to be visible through the rain, and she grabbed the nearest object, a metal strut from the collection system, and swung it at the creature's head. The apex stalker took the hit without flinching and lunged. Esselt dove sideways, Valorian reflexes saving her from jaws that snapped shut where her torso had been. She rolled to her feet, but the creature was already turning, and Dalton could see the calculation in its movements. It was learning, adapting. He reached them as it struck again. Dalton threw himself between Esselt and the creature, felt claws scrape against his shoulder as he shoved her back. The world became rain and lightning, and the overwhelming certainty that this was how he died, torn apart by an alien predator while trying to protect someone who thought he was a murderer. Then Esselt was beside him, not behind him, and her hand found his. "Together," she said. The word cut through storm noise and fear with absolute clarity. "We fight together." They moved as one organism. Dalton feinted left, drawing the creature's attention, while Esselt circled right with the metal strut. When it turned to track him, she drove the improvised spear through the gap in its armor plating where neck met shoulder. The creature screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and thrashed, nearly taking Esselt off her feet. Dalton grabbed the plasma torch from his belt. The charge was low, barely enough for 30 seconds of cutting flame, but 30 seconds would have to be enough. He activated it and thrust the white-hot tip directly into the creature's thermal sensing organs along its spine. The apex stalker convulsed once and went still. They collapsed together in the mud and rain, both of them shaking, both of them bleeding from a dozen small wounds neither had noticed during the fight. Esselt's hand was still in his, gripped tight enough to hurt. Her markings pulsed erratically, shock overriding control. "You came back," she said. Her voice was raw. "I thought after what I said—" "I'm an idiot," Dalton interrupted, "but I'm not that much of an idiot." He squeezed her hand, felt her squeeze back. "You had every right to question me. I would have questioned me." "No." Esselt turned to face him fully, rain streaming down her blue skin and washing pink hair into her eyes. "I was afraid, not of you, of this, of needing someone, of trusting and being wrong and losing." Her voice cracked. "My people believe emotional attachment is weakness, that logic and duty must supersede personal connection. But logic did not save me from that beam. Logic did not fight beside me just now. You did." Dalton reached up and pushed wet hair back from her face, his fingers tracing the white markings on her cheekbone. "For what it's worth, I'm terrified too. I've spent my whole life pushing people away before they could leave first. Easier to be alone than to risk caring about someone who'll eventually figure out I'm not worth the trouble." "That is the single stupidest thing I have heard you say." Esselt's markings flared with sudden intensity. "And given some of your repair theories, that is a significant achievement." He laughed, surprised the sound could still come out of him. "Yeah, well, you're not exactly a prize either. You analyze everything to death, and you make faces at my cooking." Your cooking is barely edible. But you eat it anyway. Because the alternative is starvation. Her lips curved in something that might have been a smile. And because watching you coax broken machines back to life with nothing but stubbornness and profanity is oddly endearing. They were still sitting in the mud with a dead predator 5 meters away and toxic rain soaking through their clothes, but Dalton couldn't remember the last time anything had felt this right. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she closed the distance and pressed her forehead against his, her markings blazing so bright they cast light on his face. My people have a concept, she said quietly. Celerai, the bond between warriors who have saved each other's lives and are therefore responsible for each other's futures. Humans call it love, Dalton replied. It means choosing to stay even when leaving would be easier. Then I choose to stay. Her hand tightened on his, and I choose to trust you, not because logic demands it, but because you have earned it. The storm began to break. They made their way back to the shelter together, supporting each other's weight, and inside they stripped off soaked clothing and shared emergency rations and said nothing for a long time because words felt inadequate. When they finally returned to the Sabotage data, they approached it differently, not as potential adversaries, but as partners working toward truth. The coordinates, Esselt said, studying the transmission log. They match something in the ship's historical database, a corporate mining survey from 5 years ago. Dalton pulled up the survey file. Cathara 7, mineral-rich but classified uninhabitable due to environmental hazards. Survey was conducted by Helix Resource Extraction. I know that company. Esselt's voice went cold. They were implicated in illegal strip mining operations on protected worlds. My diplomatic mission was carrying evidence of treaty violations for presentation to the Galactic Commerce Council. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. They brought the ship down to destroy the evidence. You were the target. And everyone else, including you, was simply collateral damage. Esselt's markings pulsed with barely contained fury. Expendable variables in a corporate risk assessment. Dalton felt something hard settling in his chest. Not fear. Rage. Cold, focused, and absolutely certain. Then we survive. We get that beacon working, and we make sure everyone knows what happened here. The risks. I know the risks. He met her eyes. But I'm not dying on this planet so some corporation can cover its tracks. Are you? Esselt's markings blazed. No, I am not. They worked through the night, combining his mechanical expertise with her neural interface technology. The solution was dangerous, using her bioelectric patterns to amplify the beacon's weak signal. It would work, maybe, but the feedback could permanently damage her nervous system. I can do this, Esselt said when Dalton voiced his concerns. My people's neural architecture is designed for high-bandwidth data processing. The risk is acceptable. Nothing about this is acceptable. Then what alternative do you propose? She touched his face gently. We have no other options. Either I attempt this, or we wait for our respirator filters to fail and die slowly from spore exposure. Dalton wanted to argue, to find some other solution that didn't require her to risk everything. But she was right, and they both knew it. Okay, he said finally, but I'm staying with you through the whole thing. If something goes wrong, then you will carry me back to the shelter and continue working on alternative solutions. Her smile was small but genuine, because that is what we do, we survive. They prepared through the following day, reviewing the procedure until both could recite it perfectly. Esselt would interface directly with the beacon's transmission array, using her neural implants to boost and modulate the signal. Dalton would monitor her vitals and terminate the connection if her system started to fail. As artificial evening settled over Cathara 7's poisoned landscape, they stood together at the beacon housing and prepared to bet everything on one desperate transmission. Ready? Dalton asked. Esselt's markings pulsed in steady, determined rhythm. She took his hand and squeezed once. Ready. She placed her palm against the interface plate, and her markings went supernova bright as neural pathways synchronized with alien machinery. Dalton watched her vitals on the salvaged medical scanner, saw her heart rate spike and her neural activity pattern into dangerous oscillations. The beacon began to transmit. Esselt screamed. Her body convulsed, muscles locking as feedback tore through her nervous system. Dalton caught her as she collapsed, holding her steady while the transmission continued. 30 seconds. 40. Her markings flickered erratically, going dark and bright in patterns that looked like pain made visible. "Hold on," Dalton whispered against her hair. "Just hold on." At 60 seconds, the beacon's transmission ended. Esselt went limp in his arms, unconscious but breathing. Dalton carried her back to the shelter, laid her on the thermal blankets, and stayed beside her through the following hours while her markings slowly stabilized into normal patterns and her breathing deepened into something that looked like sleep rather than shock. When she finally woke, 3 days later, a Valorian rescue ship was already in orbit. Esselt woke to descent thrusters and Dalton's hand wrapped around hers. Her neural pathways felt scorched, every thought moving through static, but she was alive. Through the viewport, she saw the sleek lines of a Valorian cruiser settling onto Cathara 7's surface. "Your people," Dalton said, voice rough from 3 days without sleep. "They're here." "They will want to separate us for debriefing," Esselt managed, sitting up despite her vision graying. "Let them try." The rescue team arrived within the hour. 6 Valorians in environmental suits, moving with military efficiency. Their leader removed his helmet, revealing darker blue skin and prominent white markings signifying command rank. "Ada Silt," he said formally. "I am Commander Tellus. You have survived against considerable odds." Not alone, Esselt forced herself to stand. "This is Dalton Reed. He is the reason I am alive." Tellus assessed Dalton clinically. "The human salvage engineer. Your physical proximity suggests significant protocol deviations requiring formal review." "My physical proximity kept us both alive for 43 days, Esselt said. "Protocol can accommodate that reality." "You will return to the ship for medical evaluation. The human will be transported separately." "No." Her markings flared with enough intensity that 2 rescue team members stepped back. "We stay together." Dalton pulled the data chip from his belt. "Before you continue with protocols, Commander, you should know this crash was deliberate sabotage. I have the evidence." Tellus took the chip, his expression shifting as he reviewed the contents. "These are serious allegations." "They're facts." Dalton stepped closer to Esselt, shoulders touching. "Helix resource extraction brought that ship down to kill a diplomat carrying evidence of their illegal operations. Everyone else was collateral damage. You can split us up and run protocols, or you can help us make sure the people responsible answer for what they did." "And what exactly is the nature of your partnership?" "We're Celari," Esselt said. "He saved my life, I saved his. We are responsible for each other's futures." "Celari is a military bond between warriors." Tellus's voice carried warning. "It does not typically apply to civilian survival situations. Cathara 7 taught me that survival is about choosing who you fight for." Esselt met his eyes without flinching. "I choose Dalton, regardless of how that choice is classified. This chip contains the evidence I was carrying, proof of corporate treaty violations. If you separate us now, you risk losing both evidence and witnesses." Dalton added quietly, "And you risk looking like you're covering for the same corporations we're trying to expose." Tellus's markings pulsed with frustrated deliberation. Finally, he nodded sharply. "Very well. You will both return to the ship together, but once we reach station, this situation will undergo full review." "Understood," Esselt said. "And Commander, thank you." Survive 43 days on a death world and emerge with actionable intelligence against one of the galaxy's most powerful corporations. Tellus's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That deserves recognition, whatever form your partnership takes." The medical bay was sterile and efficient. Doctors examined Esselt's neural pathways with humming instruments, their markings pulsing with professional concern. "Significant damage to your interface nodes," the lead physician said. "You will require extensive rehabilitation. Some functions may never fully recover." "Will I survive?" "Yes, but your capacity for neural interfacing will be substantially reduced." "Then I can live with that." She looked to where Dalton stood outside the bay, refusing to leave despite requests. "Some things are worth the cost." The physician followed her gaze. The human? His name is Dalton, and yes, her markings pulsed with quiet certainty. He is worth everything. Over the following days, they gave their testimony. The evidence was damning. Proof that Helix Resource Extraction had not only conducted illegal mining, but orchestrated mass murder to conceal it. Esselt's diplomatic credentials gave the accusation weight. Dalton's technical analysis made it irrefutable. Commander Tellis ensured the information reached appropriate authorities, despite pressure to classify the incident. There would be consequences, though likely financial rather than criminal. But they had survived. That meant something. On their final night aboard the Valorian vessel, Dalton found Esselt at a viewport watching stars stream past. Her markings brightened in greeting when he approached. Commander Tellis informed me I must choose, she said, return to Valoria for rehabilitation or request asylum among human worlds. What do you want? I want to wake up and know you are there. I want to argue about repair techniques and eat your terrible cooking. I want to build something that is ours. Dalton took her hand, lacing their fingers together. Then we find a place that'll let us be what we are, without asking permission. And what are we? Survivors. He traced the white markings on her face. Partners, Celerai, whatever word works as long as it means we don't let go. Her markings pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Then I choose asylum. I choose you. I choose the future we survived to have. 3 days later, they disembarked at Crossroads Station, a border outpost where multiple species intersected and cultural protocols blurred. Not elegant like Valorian colonies or chaotic like human settlements. Simply functional. Perfect. Dalton found them quarters in the civilian sector. Esselt filed the asylum request, severing her formal ties to Valoria. They gave final depositions to Galactic Commerce investigators, watched as Helix executives were summoned for questioning. The rest was healing. Esselt's rehabilitation was slow and painful. Some mornings her hands would not respond correctly, neural pathways misfiring. Dalton stayed close during those times, patient and steady, offering help without diminishing her independence. He found work in the station's repair sector, his talent for coaxing broken systems back to life valuable in a place with incompatible equipment standards. Esselt eventually joined him, her analytical skills and diplomatic training translating well to contract negotiation and client relations. They built a life together, small and imperfect and utterly theirs. 6 months after leaving Catharava 7, they stood at the same viewport where Esselt had made her choice. The stars looked different here, unfamiliar constellations, no home world in sight for either of them. Do you ever regret it? Dalton asked. Leaving everything behind? Esselt's markings pulsed in thoughtful patterns before settling into soft, steady glow. I regret the people who died. I regret that corporations can commit murder without consequence. I regret I will never fully recover from the neural damage. She turned to face him, her hand finding his. But I do not regret this. Us, everything we survived to become. Dalton pulled her close. Her markings blazed bright against his chest, visible even through his shirt. The death world didn't break us, he said quietly. No. Esselt's voice carried absolute certainty. It revealed that we were always stronger together than either of us could be alone. They stood while the station hummed around them, and the future stretched out uncertain and terrifying and full of possibility. Two survivors who had learned that love was not weakness but the greatest form of courage, the willingness to trust, to stay, to choose connection, even when every instinct screamed for self-preservation. Outside the viewport, a ship departed for the outer colonies, its engines flaring bright against the darkness. Somewhere in the station, equipment needed repair, and contracts needed negotiation, and life continued in all its messy, imperfect complexity. Esselt's hand tightened in Dalton's. Her markings pulsed once, twice, settling into the rhythm that meant home. Catharava 7 had tried to kill them. Instead, it taught them how to live.